Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is G3Iron and today we are going to talk about the Labyrinth. We asked the question on our YouTube community page the other day, what are your thoughts on ascending presently in Path of Exile? Are there annoyances about the Labyrinth? Is there something that you'd like to see different when it comes to ascending in Path of Exile 2? We already know from the get-go that Path of Exile 2 is going to have a bit different approach in terms of ascending and reaching those power levels from Path of Exile 1 to Path of Exile 2 whenever it is that it comes out. So knowing that there's going to be differences between one version of Ascending and another version of Ascending, we're chatting about some of those differences, some of those difficulties, and frankly, some of our complaints that we've got with the Labyrinth as it is currently constructed. Thanks so much to each and every one of you who participated on this community discussion. And of course, if you didn't get a chance to weigh in on our community discussion, you can drop a comment down below to let us know what your thoughts are on the present situation of Ascending in Path of Exile. If you are new to the channel, then you can of course like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions just like this one. And if at any point in time you'd like to join our Discord to have more conversations like this, or join our Patreon to support the channel, all of that information is down below in the video description for your convenience. The first two comments that we're going to interact with today are from Angry Peon and Kevin. Both of them have got similar themes, so we're going to tackle both of these at the same time. Angry Peon writes, tying important character progression to an incredibly boring slog is no bueno. Lab isn't hard, it's just strenuously tedious. RNGing access to Uber Lab is similarly maddening. Kevin writes, Lab is really easy TBH, but Uber Lab is pretty RNG. My League starter was level 91 until I was able to find all the trials, too lazy to dive into chat to find help for that. The worst offender in Lab is that once you get your Ascendancy, you pretty much never interact with it again. Don't make me talk about the Lab enchants because that system sucks. Now, both of these comments have got some similar elements to it, and a lot of us have got similar opinions to both of these players in terms of our reactions to the RNG and to the layers of RNG that are the Labyrinth. When we talk about the Labyrinth, we're really talking about layers, right? Like ogres. Ogres are like layers, right? Like the Labyrinth has got layers of RNG baked into it. First off, the Labyrinth itself on a daily basis resets its RNG layout. Okay, so that's one layer of RNG. Secondly, each and every enchant that is available in the Labyrinth is going to be RNG based, right? Whether or not you're looking at the lab enchants for gloves, for helmets, for boots, or now for belts, everything about the lab enchantment system is RNG based. In order to even get into your final Labyrinth, which for a lot of builds, getting all 4 labs done is essential for the build. Ascendancies often have a massive amount of power packed into them. So while there are some builds, like some of the builds that I like to play in SSF, that don't necessarily require you to get your Uber Lab Ascendancy, and I specifically play those builds because I never know if I'm going to get all of my trials done for my Uber Lab Ascendancy, the vast majority of the game relies on getting all 4 of your Ascendancies done to grab all 8 points. So those few minuscule SSF, 3 Ascendancy only builds aside, the vast majority of the game is built around getting 4 Ascendancies done. So we've got layers of RNG as a reward inside the Labyrinth. We've got layers of RNG as a layout for the Labyrinth, and then we've got layers of RNG for actually accessing the endgame version of the Labyrinth. Now, on the one hand, this is really, really cool, and I might get some pushback for that. Feel free to push back down below. But this is actually really, really cool in that the Labyrinth has the only system in Path of Exile that is truly competitive and tied to a competitive reward. So on the one hand, from a design perspective, you might say there is this unique reward that comes out every single day for the fastest players who run through the Labyrinth. So in this regard, you want the layouts to be RNG, and you want the drops and the rewards to be RNG because players are going to be built for speed when they are racing. That is a small, minuscule, tiny fraction of the entire population of the Path of Exile gaming community that's interacting with the Labyrinth. So you've got its entire design, which oftentimes the cool aspects about it that are cool are built around this competitive aspect of it that the vast majority of players don't interact with. And honestly, most players haven't even heard. I bet a lot of you who are discussing and watching this video today didn't even realize that there's a competitive aspect to the Labyrinth. And now that you know about it, you might look it up. but you're probably never actually going to compete once you see the times that the racers actually have pushing through the labyrinth. So on the one hand, I might want to push back on Kevin and Angry Peon and be like, you know what? It's actually good that there's some RNG built into the labyrinth all over the place, because people are going to go really fast, and that adds some freshness to the races that occur on a daily basis. But the reality is that I think the player amount and the player count that are actually interacting with that competitive side of the labyrinth that makes the RNG side of the labyrinth cool, I think it is vastly outweighed by the thousands, the tens of thousands of us that have no idea or no interest in participating or no competitive chance of participating in the labyrinth races and just care about getting that fourth ascendancy point. And so therefore, all of these layers of RNG are just maddening and frustrating for us. CF Worthy takes us to our second discussion point today about the labyrinth by discussing ascendancies themselves. He writes, ascendancies are losing their identity as more of the exclusive passives are added to the skill tree for anyone to obtain. It would be nice to have some added benefits to farming the lab. I've yet to try the new Uber Lab tokens. Perhaps it would be cool to have the lab itself be more of a maze with multiple possible endings and reward outcomes. To make things easier for the SSF players, make the Uber Lab cost 6 offerings without the requirement of finding all the individual trials, so that it wouldn't matter in what order you found them. Now, there's a couple of different solutions that have gone on and been mentioned throughout the time that the Labyrinth has been out, since Ascendancies came out, about making the Uber Lab trials more available. There's a couple of these different schools of thought and suggestions. One of the schools of thought is essentially to add an offering of the goddess to a map device, which then guarantees that a lab trial will appear in that particular map. We certainly know that Grinding Gear Games has the technology to make specific types of content appear in maps when you put something additional into the map device, whether that's a scarab or whether that's a sack frag. We know that there's a lot of different ways that you can interact with a map device in order to augment the instance that you're about to enter into. The timeless domain encounters from Legion, that's another great example. Or Adziri fragments, Shaper fragments, or Elder fragments is another example. There's a lot of different combinations and recipes for interacting and creating specific zones. What if we could add a specific zone by creating and guaranteeing that there could be lab trials included in the map? I think that's a great suggestion. Another suggestion, just like CF Worthy has said, is this idea that you will guarantee direct entrance into the lab. So rather than saying we need to rework the system of finding the RNG trials or the random trials, we could guarantee that there's just a system whereby you can circumvent that entire RNG process of finding the trials and simply guarantee entrance into the Uber Lab. I think that the guarantee of approaching the labyrinths is something that Grinding Gear Games is a remnant of their design philosophy from a prior age when Ascendancies actually were first introduced to the game. I don't think that PoE 2 is actually going to be much help in this regard, and there's a couple of reasons why. Some of you may have already caught on to this, some of you may not. It's relatively straightforward when you think about it. The RNG aspect of finding the trials to access the Uber Lab won't get fixed just because PoE 2 introduces a new way to ascend. PoE 2 will most likely introduce a new way to ascend for those first 3 lab trials that you would normally go through and acquire throughout the first 10-act story campaign of Path of Exile 1. That's the normal way that you get through the normal, the cruel, and the merciless labyrinths. That's the part that's probably going to get reworked with PoE 2, unless the entire Ascendancy system gets reworked with PoE 2. The reason why I don't think that the RNG aspect of lab trials are necessarily going to get reworked with PoE 2 is because they're map tied. They're tied to the end game of Path of Exile, which PoE 2 has not promised us a new end game, but rather a new secondary campaign to progress through. So a lot of players oftentimes will say, yeah, well, Iron, we just have to wait for PoE 2. That's when everything and all the problems are going to get solved for Ascendancies. I've got lots of thoughts about PoE 2. I've got lots of thoughts about the way how Grinding Gear Games is building up towards PoE 2 right now, whether that's with league mechanics or whether that's with systemic mechanics and built-in mechanics of the game engine itself. We've seen that most notably with Vulkan, but we've seen it with other improvements as well. I've got lots of thoughts on that, but when it comes to the Labyrinth, since we know that PoE 2 is going to be a different campaign to play through, what we're seeing there in the difference with the Ascendancy is most likely going to be the first 3 Ascendancies, and the Uber Lab will then share a common point of entry with the first Path of Exile campaign in order to reach your 4th Ascendancy, because it's accessed via maps, and maps, to our knowledge, at least as of right now, aren't getting some sort of massive overhaul in PoE 2. So all that is to say, I like these suggestions. I like the suggestion of using, 6 offerings and just guaranteeing an entrance into the Uber Lab. I like the suggestion that you can place an offering inside the map device and just get guaranteed access to at least one trial. That keeps some RNG to it, but it at least guarantees that you're getting something of a trial. And it's also a one-to-one sacrifice, right? You're using an offering of the goddess to guarantee one offering of the goddess back. That cost ratio might be problematic because essentially once you find one offering of the goddess, you can just essentially just keep chaining them. And is it really RNG at that point? You're just hoping and praying that a specific offering turns up. So maybe GGG won't go in that direction, but I think both of those suggestions are pointing towards a very, very real problem, which is if Path of Exile is more and more designed towards SSF, in other words, that's what the game is being designed around, and then everything else is expanded on from there. If SSF is the baseline, then should SSF have some sort of way of guaranteeing trials? And we're seeing that more than ever right now with Harvest League, that SSF and Harvest League are just a match made in heaven. And it seems like Harvest League has been designed with a lot of SSF principles in mind. So if that's something that's going on in the design philosophy of grinding gear games right now, that might be something that we can see going on in the future with Path of Exile 2 and with future expansions and leagues after Path of Exile 2 4.0 is released, where GGG is going to maybe separate themselves a little bit from the RNG and maybe give some craftable, targetable ways for SSF players to interact with various previously known RNG mechanics like the Uber Lab. Now, before everybody thinks that all we're doing today is complaining or giving perspectives on complaining, Sam Rezik gives us at least one perspective from a player who enjoys the Labyrinth as it is presently constructed. So let's take a look into what Sam says. I find the lab itself exhilarating. The hardcore aspect has me on edge the entire time I'm in there. It gets very frustrating when I'm having trouble and have to restart the run half a dozen times, but it's worth it when I finally clear. That said, getting into the Uber Lab needs to change. I'm still on 3 of 6 on trials, while level 87 this league. And the enchant system needs some tinkering too. Maybe something as simple as pick the item type to enchant. The game generates the enchant, then you can put it on a specific item. Or weight the enchant to the defense type of the item. My bone circlet doesn't need a buff to lacerate. Sam, I'm actually with you on a lot of this. I'm with you on the aspect of the hardcore aspect of the Labyrinth. I think for the amount of power that you get from an Ascendancy, it's a very, very interesting and neat experience at first, to go through the Labyrinth and have it be something of a hardcore experience for the player where you really do need to think about your defenses, you really do need to think about your damage, and you really do need to think about your positioning, whether that's because of lab traps or whether that's because of Azaro or some other danger that you encounter inside the Labyrinth. I think the hardcore aspect of the Labyrinth gives players inside of Path of Exile, whether they are playing hardcore or softcore, whether they're playing Trade League or SSF, a moment to slow down and consider. Now, some of you who are veterans out there are just going to laugh at that. Like, who slows down and considers anything in the Labyrinth? LOL, we can just rush it and it's a joke, right? For some players, no matter the difficulty on anything, some things are going to be a joke for them, no matter what. I had a college roommate who was just insanely good at any of those band games. Do you remember like the band hero games or Guitar Hero, etc.? Like, he could do anything. He couldn't play actual instruments, but he could do all of the things that were required to get like amazingly perfect scores on stuff. I, however, couldn't play any of those games to save my life, even on the easiest versions of them. My point in bringing that up is just to say that there are going to be some skill requirements for any skill-based system that some players are going to be better at than others. There's going to be a spectrum. And so the spectrum that exists inside the Labyrinth, I think, is a good thing and representative of the trade-offs of the difficulty of the Labyrinth representing the power level of the Labyrinth. When you do complete your Labyrinth, it is a significant boost of power, depending, of course, on your ascendancy, but for the most part, it is a significant boost of power, whether or not you're doing your Normal Lab, your Cruel Lab, your Merc Lab, or your Uber Lab. It is generally a significant boost for whatever it is that your build is going for, whether that's offense, defense, or utility. It is a massive boost, and I think there ought to be some level of difficulty in achieving that level of boost. That being said, aside for the first few couple of times where it's hardcore and you're going, yeah, this is a lot of power, and yeah, this is really cool, and yeah, it's balanced, It is a massive, massive headache, especially for a lot of players. And the number of players commenting on this thread that were simply saying, yeah, the hardcore nature of the Labyrinth actually sucks, because whenever I've got a blue screen of death, whenever I've got a crash, whenever I've got a disconnect, whenever I've got to go AFK for a moment and then I just fail to load into the next instance, whenever I get to the third instance of Azaro and something distracts me and so then I die, then I've got to restart and go all over again. The Labyrinth is probably one of the least casual friendly aspects of content in Path of Exile. And on the one hand, well, I think that's a good thing because Path of Exile is the action RPG's elitist game. I think it's also maybe too elitist for a lot of players where they simply can't access it. And when that becomes a problem where you can't access content because it's crashing or because it's inconsistent, that just leads to frustration. That's not a player problem. It's not a problem with your build. It's not a problem with your character. It's not a problem with your play and your piloting of your build or your character. It's just a problem with the system. And so, of course, that, as always, needs to be improved upon. Nobody likes crashing in any game. And, of course, with the hardcore nature of Labyrinth, that is always the worst time to have a crash. Speaking of enchants, let's wrap up our discussion today by chatting about the enchantment system for just a few moments. Roy gives us a basis and a platform to launch this discussion. The lab can be punishing to certain builds, but overall, I think it is a reasonable gear check. The enchant system is terrible, laughable joke and needs to be reworked or removed. Maybe we could get a random drop similar to Divine Vessels that lets us put a gem in it, and then your Uber Lab enchantment guarantees one of those enchants for your helm. There are multiple enchants for each skill, so you still may have to run the lab a few times to get the one you want. That seems reasonable, or just scrap the enchant system and rework the skills that really need the helm enchant to shine. Roy, I think this is a beautiful suggestion. It's been mentioned in the past, and I think it ought to continually be made as a suggestion moving forward into the future. Maybe POE 2 is where we see all of these reworks come and take place. Maybe it's going to be in a league prior to POE 2. Maybe it'll be in a league after POE 2. But I think the lab enchant system is another massive portion of a rework that needs to happen. We did a video some time ago, I don't know, more than a year ago, where we discussed lab helmet enchants themselves. And at that point in time, more than a year ago, that doesn't count all of the new skills that have come into the game, after that video was made. At that point in time, there were more than 500 different helmet lab enchants available. That's a massive amount of helmet enchants. Think about it for just a moment. Even if you are able to run, let's say 10 labyrinths in the space of an hour, that means on average, you are getting what is that? 10 minutes through the Uber Lab. Let's just say on average. And let's say you use the twice enchant system, right? So you get 2 enchants for every 1 run that you make. So that means you're getting 20 enchants every single hour. That means if all of the enchantment system was equally weighted, right? If none of them were slightly weighted or skewed towards being more common and others were skewed towards being more rare. If everything was equal in terms of helmet enchants, you would need to spend 25 hours running the labyrinth in order to see 1 enchant from all 500 different enchants. Now, those numbers are a bit off because we've now got more than 500 enchants, and it's possible that you could just get RNG and get lucky, right? Which that's the case in Path of Exile across the board. You can always just get RNG and get lucky. I mean, those of you who want a headhunter, why don't you just do a Zana influenced map and take 2 chance orbs and go chance a leather belt? I mean, you could get lucky, right? That's not the way most of PoE works, though. Path of Exile is very much a game that has weighting to it. And so I think this is one of the reasons why this suggestion by Roy and others have made similar suggestions in the past, where we essentially get some sort of item that allows us to either store the lab enchant that we get from the particular end of an Uber Lab run. Now, some of you might say, well, Iron, you already kind of can do that because you can put a helmet enchant onto a helm and then you sell that helmet, right? The problem with that is that each different helmet base type doesn't necessarily want the helmet enchant that you're going to get. We've already heard today from one person with the example about using a hubris circlet for a lacerate build. And on the one hand, while you might say, oh, that sounds cool, maybe you're going for, let's say, a chaos inoculated build, so you're going to want a hubris circlet, and maybe you're doing a CI lacerate build. While that's true that it's possible that you might want to do that, and while it's true that some players might use the RNG system of the Uber Lab to determine their next build, the vast majority of players are not doing that. The vast majority of players are hoping for getting a particular enchant on their gear that is already relative to their current build or to a build that they've planned in the future. Or alternatively to someone else's build that is common in the league that they can then sell if they're playing in a trade league. So the problem is multifaceted. There's simply too many enchants for it to be relatively consistent for a lot of players to want to farm the Uber Labyrinth to find their enchant. And on the other hand, we've got it so that way the storage system for enchants right now simply isn't very reliable. So an improvement to either of these two systems I think would be a great idea, either by lowering the total amount of helmet enchants that are in the game. And on the one hand, that might kill certain niche builds that have used very specific and unique versions of helmet enchants for their skills. On the other hand, it's going to add consistency to a wide variety of players who are looking for a particular helmet enchant. I would personally be more in favor of reworking helmet enchants so that way it's more of a tradable, storable item, sort of similar to what we've got going on right now in Harvest with horticulture stations, where essentially you've got crafts that are there for you, waiting for you, whenever it is that you want to craft them in the future. And I think this might be a glimpse into what we'll see in the future with the crafting system. Not to go too far down that rabbit hole. But I do think Harvest is giving us a preview of what GGG is thinking about reworking and moving forward into a new era of crafting in general. And we might see that come to fruition with a revamp of the Lord's Labyrinth and with the way how enchant systems work there. Maybe we get something like a Divine Vessel or like a gem or like a currency that essentially stores a helmet enchant for future usage. And maybe it's account bound or maybe it's tradable. I don't know. Either way, I think would still be good, because even if you just want to be a dedicated lab farmer, you don't necessarily want to put a specific lab enchant onto a specific base type. So I think having the item, even if it's account bound and you can't trade it, having it so that way you can store it and then put it on an item that you do want, I do think that fixes some of the issue. Well, thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion about the Lord's Labyrinth and Ascending. If you've got thoughts, suggestions, ideas, or maybe pushback on any of the stuff that we've chatted about today, feel free to drop us a comment down below. And as always, I hope in whatever league you're playing PoE, I hope today is the day a Mirror of Calandra drops for you.
Thanks for watching that video. If you'd like more information on any of our discussion points today, you can see them down below in the video description. If you'd also like to join our Discord or support our Patreon, you can do so with the links down below. Thanks again, and big shout out to all of our Patreon supporters.